A powerful millionaire saw his life turn upside down when a cruel illness took away his strength, his independence, and even the people who said they loved him. Trapped in a silent mansion, dependent on help for even the simplest tasks, he believed his fate was already sealed. It was then that a caregiver arrived with a seemingly simple mission: to bathe, feed, and care for him during his final days. But, between revealed secrets, unexpected betrayals, and a feeling that no one predicted, that professional relationship ended up going much further than anyone imagined. Before discovering how this moving story transforms into something totally unexpected, subscribe to the channel and prepare to meet one of the most surprising accounts of love and overcoming you have ever heard. E-Time Bibi woke up to the sound of luxury cars sliding over the wet November asphalt, and Rodrigo Cavalcante was still sleeping between Egyptian silk sheets when the sun was already heating the glass panes of the penthouse. 35 years old, owner of Cavalcante Incorporações, one of the most remembered names in the social columns of São Paulo, he had the kind of life that appeared in magazines even before it was lived. The photos arrived first: Rodrigo in Ibiza, Rodrigo in the VIP box of the Brazil GP, Rodrigo smiling beside Veronica Menezes, the woman who had accompanied him for 3 years and who had the same calculated shine as the jewelry she wore around her neck. That morning, however, something was different. Rodrigo woke up with a numbness on the left side of his body that was not new, but had grown during the night like a silent tide. He tried to lift his arm and felt a disproportionate effort, as if the limb weighed double. He lay there for a few minutes, looking at the exposed concrete ceiling he himself had chosen in the apartment project, and took a deep breath. It wasn't the first time. For weeks, small signs had appeared and disappeared, and he ignored them with the same efficiency with which he delegated boring problems to his legal team. He got up slowly, showered alone, put on the grey suit that his assistant had hung on the closet door, and went downstairs, where breakfast was already set. Veronica was sitting at the table with her phone in hand, sliding the screen without looking up when he entered. She had long dark hair, that type of beauty that asked for light, and she knew how to use it well. "You're late for the meeting with the partners," she said, still looking at the screen. "Good morning to you too," Rodrigo replied, sitting down carefully. She looked up for a second and went back to her phone. "Your coffee is cold." Rodrigo drank it anyway. There was something in that apartment, in that luxury silence between the two of them, that he had learned not to name. It was easier that way. Life was good in practical terms, and he had reached the conclusion long ago that comfort and affection rarely lived in the same house. The meeting at the office went well, as it always did. Rodrigo was good at what he did. He had inherited the company from his father at 26, when the founder of Cavalcante Incorporações was taken by a heart attack that no one expected, and he had tripled the assets in less than a decade. He knew every detail of the developments he managed, knew how to negotiate, knew how to listen, and knew, above all, when to be quiet. But that afternoon, in the middle of a presentation about a new launch in Jardins, he lost his balance while getting up from his chair. He tried to hold onto the table, failed, and fell to the floor of the meeting room in front of 6 partners and 2 lawyers. The silence that followed lasted less than 3 seconds, but Rodrigo felt every fraction of them. "I'm fine," he said before anyone moved, and he repeated, already standing with the help of his assistant's arm, "I'm fine." But he wasn't, and deep down, since that numbness that grew like a tide, he already knew it. The tests began that same week. Neurologists, orthopedists, specialists that Veronica scheduled with the same practicality with which she organized social events. The results took a few days, and when they arrived, they were delivered in a white-walled office in Jardim Europa by a calm-voiced doctor who had the habit of speaking while looking at the paper instead of looking at the patient. Early-stage amyotrophic lateral sclerosis, a disease that attacked motor neurons and progressed in different ways in each person, but always progressed. There was no cure. There was management, treatment, adaptation. The doctor used these words with the care of someone disarming a bomb, and Rodrigo heard everything with the neutral expression he had learned to use in difficult negotiations. Veronica took his hand when they left. It was a brief gesture, but Rodrigo noticed. In the following weeks, life continued in a strange way. as if the world didn't know it had been shaken. The office functioned, projects advanced, Rodrigo continued appearing at meetings. But the body did not respect the schedule. The numbness spread in a hurry, and one morning he found himself unable to correctly fasten his shirt buttons alone. He asked his assistant for help and said nothing to anyone. Then came the accident. A night of light rain on marginal Pinheiros, a car that skidded to the left, the collision that no one had time to avoid. Rodrigo hadn't driven for weeks because of the tremors, but he was in the passenger seat when the impact happened. The car spun before stopping at the guardrail, and he was thrown against the door with enough force to fracture 3 vertebrae in the thoracic region. When he woke up at Hospital Syrio-Libanese 2 days later, with Veronica sitting in an armchair next to the bed and the neurologist waiting on the other side of the curtain, Rodrigo realized that the life he knew had stayed outside that room. The combination of the disease with the spinal injuries created a condition that the doctors called severe motor impairment. In practice, it meant that Rodrigo Cavalcante, the man who had built an empire of concrete and glass in São Paulo, would need help to perform the most basic daily tasks. Veronica heard the diagnosis with her eyes fixed on the window, and when the doctor left, she remained in silence for a long time before saying, with the soft voice she used when she wanted to seem delicate, "We are going to hire someone to help you, a professional caregiver. It's the best for you." Rodrigo looked at her and did not respond. Not because he didn't know what to say, but because at that moment he felt, with the hard clarity of real things, that she was not talking about what was best for him. She was talking about what was best for her. He closed his eyes and let the distant noise of the city enter through the half-open window. São Paulo continued outside, noisy and indifferent, and Rodrigo Cavalcante, for the first time in his life, did not know what it would be like to wake up the next day. But the next day would arrive anyway, it always did. Camila Rocha was 29 years old and had a worn leather backpack she had carried since nursing school in Campinas. She wasn't the type of person who drew attention when entering a place, which in her profession was almost a quality. She knew how to move through spaces without making noise, knew how to read the environment before speaking, and had learned early on that patience was not weakness. It was the sharpest tool a caregiver could have. She had worked for the last 4 years on difficult cases, elderly people with advanced Alzheimer's, adults recovering from strokes, a businessman from the ABC region who had lost leg mobility in a fall and who at first threw his water glass at the wall when she entered the room. Camila had learned from each of them. She had arrived for the job at Rodrigo Cavalcante's apartment by recommendation from a colleague, with a resume delivered to Veronica by email and a 20-minute interview in a living room where everything matched too much, the vases, the paintings, the cushions, as if someone had set up a stage instead of a home. Veronica received her standing, with the posture of someone used to hiring people. She read the resume without haste, asked the right questions in the wrong tone, and at the end said, "You start Monday. The salary is above market. I expect total professionalism." And then, almost as an appendix, "Rodrigo can be difficult. Don't take it personally." Camila didn't. On the first morning, she arrived at 7:30, was received by Dona Conceição, the housekeeper who had worked in the house for 12 years, and went up to Rodrigo's room with a coffee tray that no one had requested, but that she had prepared as a way to initiate contact without solemnity. It was a simple trick. Food opened up space where words didn't yet fit. Rodrigo was awake, lying on his back looking at the ceiling. When she entered, he turned his head with effort and stared at her without saying anything for a few seconds. He had dark eyes, a closed expression, and the kind of silence that wasn't shyness, it was a test. "I didn't ask for coffee," he said. "I know," Camila replied, placing the tray on the small table, "but it's 7:30, and morning coffee doesn't need to be asked for." Rodrigo said nothing more. She began the routine. Those first few weeks were heavy. Rodrigo was not aggressive, but he was resistant in the way that proud people usually are when life forces them to depend on someone. He remained in silence during the bath, with his jaw locked and his eyes turned toward the wall, as if looking at Camila made the situation more real than he could bear. He didn't complain about the procedures, but neither did he collaborate beyond the minimum necessary. When she needed to reposition him in the chair or help him change clothes, he endured it, with that particular rigidity of someone who hasn't learned to receive care. Camilla didn't force it. She did what needed to be done with efficiency and respect, spoke only when necessary, and didn't try to fill the silence with unnecessary conversation. She had learned that the patients who resisted the most at the beginning were, almost always, the ones who needed the most time to understand that care was not a diminishment. Veronica appeared in the room once a day, usually at night for 10 to 15 minutes. She stayed near the door, asked how Rodrigo was with the voice of someone who already knows the answer she wants to hear, and left with her phone in hand as soon as he said, "I'm fine." Camilla observed this pattern carefully in the first week and didn't jump to conclusions, but she noticed. What changed the dynamic for the first time was a small episode on a Wednesday afternoon. Rodrigo had tried to reach a book on the shelf next to the bed and knocked over a water glass in the process. When Camilla entered, attracted by the noise, she found the glass on the floor, the book out of reach and him with his eyes fixed on the window, with the expression of someone who was fighting something internal, more difficult than the numbness in his arm. She picked up the glass, cleaned the floor, gathered the book, and placed it in his lap without commenting on the episode. Then she asked, while folding the wet towel, "Which one is this?" Rodrigo looked at her. "What?" "The book." A pause. "Posthumous Memoirs of Bras Cubas." "I've read it," Camilla said. "Twice. Machado is cruel in just the right way." Rodrigo was silent for a moment, and then, for the first time since she had arrived, said something that wasn't an instruction or a short answer. "The second reading is better. You understand that he is laughing at you the whole time." Camilla nodded. "That's it. You only realize it when you're already inside." She left the room and didn't make a big deal of that moment, but something had changed in the temperature of the space between the two of them, in a way that she recognized with the experience of someone who had seen it other times. It wasn't affection yet. It was just the first crack in the wall. In the following days, Rodrigo began to speak a bit more. Small things. A comment about a report he had read on his tablet, a complaint about excessive salt in the lunch that Donna Concheição had prepared, a question about how long it had taken Camilla to graduate. They were minimal openings, but they were openings. Camilla responded without making a fuss about these conversations, without showing that she noticed them as something special. She treated them with the same naturalness as the breakfast that was never requested, as something that was simply part of the day. Veronica, meanwhile, began to spend more time away. Dinners, events, work commitments that she mentioned in passing, and that never had much detail. Camilla didn't ask. It wasn't part of her job, and she knew how to maintain boundaries with surgical precision. But on an afternoon when she went to get a cream from the kitchen shelf, she heard Veronica, on the other side of the half-open dining room door, with the low and slightly tense voice that people use when they are certain they are alone. There was another voice on the other end of the line, male and distant on the phone speaker. Camilla stopped unintentionally, not out of curiosity, but because Rodrigo's name was mentioned in a tone that made her freeze. She didn't stay to listen. She took the cream and returned to the room with silent steps, with her heart beating a little faster than normal, and an uncomfortable feeling settled in her chest that she tried to ignore for the rest of the afternoon. But what she had heard didn't leave her head. And when she turned off the light in Rodrigo's room that night and went down to the small apartment she had rented 3 blocks away, she lay in the dark for a long time, with her eyes open to the ceiling, thinking about the weight of what she knew without having wanted to know. There was a specific quality to the November silence inside the Itaim Bibi penthouse that Camilla learned to distinguish over the weeks. It was a surface silence, the kind that covers things, not the kind that rests. The large walls, the expensive furniture, the paintings that no one really looked at. Everything composed a kind of set that was too perfect to be truly inhabited. And in the center of this set, Rodrigo Cavalcante spent his days in a chair near the window, with his tablet in his lap and his eyes frequently on the grey horizon of São Paulo. Camilla arrived at 7:30. She left between 6 and 7 in the evening. In the interval, the routine was dense: assisted bathing, medication at the right times, passive physical therapy exercises that she applied with precision, monitored feeding, and detailed records that she sent every week to the responsible doctor. It was physically demanding work, and even more emotionally demanding, because caring for someone who still remembers how they were before needing care requires a type of delicacy that isn't learned in a manual. Rodrigo was improving slowly, within what was possible. The exercises helped to delay the progression of the disease, and the spinal injuries were responding better than the doctors had initially predicted. He still needed assistance for most tasks, but there were days when he could stand for a few minutes supported by the window rail, looking at the city below with that particular expression of someone who is making peace with something. In their conversations, they had reached a point of comfort that surprised Camilla by its speed. Rodrigo was not the easy man that Veronica had described as difficult, nor was he the simple man that money usually hides. He was someone who had built his entire life around control and who was learning with real and visible difficulty to exist without it. Sometimes this came out as dry irony, sometimes as prolonged silence, and sometimes on rainy afternoons when São Paulo closed in completely and the apartment was in half light, it came out as an honesty that he seemed surprised to find in himself. On one of those afternoons, while Camila adjusted the support for his left arm, which had started to cause trouble again, Rodrigo said, without preamble, "You know that most people vanished." Camila didn't interrupt her work. Since the diagnosis, since the accident, the diagnosis had already done the first filtering. He looked at the window. "It's interesting. You spend years building a network of relationships, and you think it's solid because it weathered a few small storms. Then a big one comes and you discover that most of it was made of paper." "It happens a lot," Camilla said calmly. "It's not cruelty in most cases. It's that people don't know what to do with someone else's illness. They distance themselves because they get scared, not because they don't care." "I would prefer cruelty," he replied. "At least it would be honest." Camilla finished the adjustment and stood beside the chair. "Did any stay?" Rodrigo thought for a moment. "Marcelo, my oldest partner. He shows up every week. He stays for a while not knowing what to say, but he shows up." A pause. "And you?" "I am paid to be here." "I know," he said. And then, with that dry frankness she had learned to recognize as his way of saying things that mattered. "But there's a difference between being here because you are obligated and being here for real. Anyone who has ever depended on someone knows how to distinguish." Camilla didn't respond. She gathered the materials in her bag and went to the kitchen to get the 4 o'clock medication. While separating the pills in the small organizer, she realized she had a slight smile on her face that she hadn't noticed appearing, and she made sure to put it away before returning to the room. Veronica had spent the night out for the second time that week. When she appeared the next morning, she was in the same dress as the day before and had a tiredness in her eyes that her sunglasses didn't completely hide. She stopped by Rodrigo's room for less than 5 minutes, said she had slept at her cousin's house because of the traffic, and left again before lunch. Rodrigo didn't comment, but Camilla noticed that he became quieter that afternoon, with a distant look that wasn't melancholy. It was the look of someone who is adding things up. The tension came to the surface a few days later, on a night when Camilla had stayed later to accompany a telemedicine consultation that the neurologist had scheduled outside of the usual hours. When the consultation ended and she went to get her bag in the kitchen to leave, she heard voices in the living room. Veronica was on the phone. The door was half open, and the voice was low but clear in that large apartment silence. Camilla didn't go to the door, but stopped where she was because she heard her own name. She stood still. What she heard in the following minutes went into her like cold water. There was no ambiguity, no possibility of favorable interpretation. Veronica's voice described Rodrigo with a coldness that made the emotional distance of the last few weeks seem almost like nostalgia. She spoke about the assets, about the progression of the disease as if it were a deadline, about what would happen when the situation resolved itself. And then the voice on the other end of the line said something Camilla didn't hear completely, but Veronica responded with a soft laugh and the words, "It won't take long." Camilla took her bag slowly and left through the service hallway without making a sound. She went down the service elevator with her eyes fixed on the brushed metal door, feeling the weight of what she had heard settle over her like lead. Outside, São Paulo continued noisy and indifferent. She walked to the bus stop with cold hands inside her coat pockets and stood there for longer than she needed to, letting 2 buses pass before boarding the third. That night she didn't sleep well. She kept turning over what she had heard, trying to find a different reading, and found none. And the question that kept pulsing until dawn wasn't what to do with it, but when and how and if Rodrigo would be ready to hear a truth that could shatter the little that remained of the emotional structure he had managed to maintain. She arrived at 7:30 as always the next morning, prepared the coffee, went up the internal stairs with the tray, knocked softly on the bedroom door. And when Rodrigo said, "You may enter," she entered with the same face as always, because it wasn't time yet. But she knew the time was coming. The week that followed was one of tense normality, the kind that you recognize only later, when everything has already exploded, and you understand that the silence before was accumulated pressure, not peace. Camilla maintained the routine with the usual precision, arriving on time, fulfilling every step of care, responding to Rodrigo's questions with the same attention as always. But there was something different inside her, a kind of constant vigil, as if she were waiting for the right moment without knowing exactly how it would present itself. Rodrigo noticed that something had changed, but didn't know how to name it. She remained present, remained careful, but there was a new restraint in the pauses between sentences, an extra care in her words that he hadn't noticed before. He tried once or twice to open a longer conversation, talk about the book he had finished, ask about her family, and she responded, but from a place slightly more distant than in previous weeks, as if she were protecting something. Veronica, meanwhile, was more present than she had been in weeks. She appeared at breakfast, stayed in the living room while Camilla worked in Rodrigo's room, asked for details of the routine with an attention that seemed too new to be natural. Camilla recorded all this with the same calmness with which she recorded vital signs on the chart, with no visible reaction. The break came on a Thursday afternoon. Rodrigo had asked to be alone after lunch, which he did from time to time when he needed true silence, and Camilla had gone down to the kitchen to organize the medications for the following week. Donna Conceição was on her day off. The apartment was quiet. And then Veronica entered the kitchen with a glass in her hand and a look that Camilla immediately recognized as the look of someone who has already made a decision and is merely executing it. "I need to speak with you," Veronica said. Camilla closed the medication organizer and waited. "A watch is missing from Rodrigo's office." Veronica placed the glass on the counter with a slight click. "A Patek Philippe. It hasn't been in its place for 3 days." Camilla said nothing for a moment. And you are the only person besides me and Conceição who moves through this part of the house." "Conceição is on her day off. I haven't entered the office this week." Camilla kept her voice calm. "Did you check if Rodrigo moved the watch? Sometimes he asks for things to be brought from the office." Veronica crossed her arms. "Rodrigo doesn't remember asking, and Conceição hasn't touched anything, so it's you. You are accusing me. I am saying what seems obvious." Camilla breathed slowly. "I have never taken anything in this house. If you want to check my bag, you can check it. If you want to call the building security to review the cameras, you can do that too. I have nothing to hide." Veronica lifted her chin slightly. "Perhaps it is better if you don't return tomorrow while the situation is being investigated." "Is this a dismissal?" "It is a suspension." Camilla stood up, took her bag from the hook next to the refrigerator, and looked at Veronica for a moment with that calmness that people sometimes mistake for resignation, but which was something else entirely. It was the calmness of someone who knows exactly what is happening and why. "Fine," she said, "but before I leave, I am going up to say goodbye to Rodrigo. It is a matter of respect for the patient." Veronica opened her mouth to respond, but Camilla had already left the kitchen. She climbed the stairs slowly, with a racing heart but firm steps. She knocked on the bedroom door. Rodrigo said, "Enter," with the voice of someone who was reading. When she opened the door, he looked at her and noticed something immediately, because that was the kind of thing he had learned to read in her over the weeks. "What is it?" he asked, closing the book. Camilla entered, closed the door behind her, and stood near the window for a moment. Then she turned to him. "Veronica accused me of stealing a watch from your office." Rodrigo remained motionless. "What?" "The Patek Philippe. She says it's missing and that I am responsible." He looked at her for a long time. I asked Marcelo to bring that watch over the weekend. It is at his house to be adjusted. I asked for it myself. The silence that followed was different from all the other silences that had inhabited that room. It was a silence that had weight and edges. "Rodrigo," Camilla said, and her voice came out a bit different, a bit lower, with something she had kept for days trying to find the moment. "A few days ago, I heard a conversation that I would need to tell you. I wasn't planning on listening, and I was in doubt if it was my place to speak. But after what happened today, I can no longer remain silent." Rodrigo didn't move. He just looked at her. And she told him, without drama, without interpretation, without adjectives, only what she had heard, the words she had managed to distinguish, the tone of voice, and the laugh at the end. While she spoke, she watched his face change in a way she had never seen before. It wasn't anger yet. It was the face of someone who is recognizing, with the painful slowness of the inevitable, that a piece that didn't fit finally found its place, and the place was exactly where it hurt the most. When she finished, they remained in silence for a time she couldn't measure. Then Rodrigo said in a very quiet voice, "Where is the watch?" "At Marcelo's house. You sent it for adjustment yourself." He closed his eyes for a moment. When he opened them, there was a resolution in them that Camilla recognized as the Rodrigo of negotiations, the one who knew exactly what he wanted and how to get there. "You are not leaving today. Stay here. Veronica told me not to come back tomorrow." "Veronica is not the owner of this house." He said this with a calmness that was more definitive than any shout. "Please sit down. I'm going to need a few minutes." Camilla sat in the chair near the window. Outside, São Paulo continued in its customary indifference, oblivious to the fact that something had ended in that high-walled room, something that had started with a promise and that for a long time had occupied the space of a real thing. The confrontation happened that night. Camilla was not present, but Dona Conceição, who had returned early because of a forgotten item, heard loud voices in the upstairs hallway and then the sound of the bedroom door closing with force. Veronica left the apartment with 2 suitcases at 11 at night, and when she went down the social elevator, Camilla, who had stayed in the apartment at Rodrigo's request, observed from the kitchen window the car waiting down below depart toward Jardins. She went up to check on Rodrigo. He was sitting on the bed with his gaze fixed on the void ahead and said nothing when she entered. She prepared the night's medication, helped with what needed to be done, turned off the light, and went to sit in the hallway outside the room. She stayed there for a while with her back against the cold wall, listening to the silence of the apartment that had just changed in a definitive way. And she thought that there are certain truths that only arrive after everything else has already gone, and that being the bearer of that kind of truth is one of the loneliest jobs there is. After Veronica's departure, the apartment took a few days to find a new rhythm. It was as if the space needed to reorganize itself around an absence that, paradoxically, didn't leave a void, but took away a weight that is only noticed after it goes away. The mornings became calmer. Dona Conceição moved through the rooms with fewer hurried steps, and Rodrigo, although he was clearly processing something internally, seemed different in a way that Camilla observed carefully without commenting. He slept better. She noticed this in the usual signs of care work, in the quality of his awakening, in his willingness for exercises, in the way he ate breakfast with something approaching real presence, instead of the polite absence that had characterized many of the previous mornings. It wasn't joy. It was more like relief, the kind you don't admit you're waiting for until it arrives. In their conversations, something had changed as well. The fact that Camilla had revealed what she had heard created a different quality of trust between them, not the kind that comes from gradual and safe proximity, but the kind that comes from having crossed something together, of having been present in a moment of rupture, and having chosen honesty even when it was easier to stay silent. Rodrigo didn't speak directly about this for a few days, but he treated Camilla in a slightly different way, with an attention that she didn't know how to classify immediately. One afternoon, while she was making the day's entries in the chart, he said without looking at her, "You could have stayed quiet." She continued writing. "I could have. It would have been easier for you." "Probably." He was silent for a moment. "Why didn't you?" Camilla finished the sentence she was writing and closed the notebook. Because someone needed to not stay quiet. Rodrigo looked at her then, with that direct gaze he used when he was evaluating something seriously, and then he turned to the window without saying anything more. But there was something in that, turning away, that wasn't an evasion, it was processing. The days passed with the regularity typical of intensive care, which has a particular monotony, mixed with constant unforeseen events. The neurologist came for an in-person evaluation and was surprisingly positive, words like stabilization and response above expected, appearing in the conversation in a way that made Rodrigo stay silent for a long time after the doctor left. Camilla found him at the living room window that afternoon, standing with the support of the rail, looking at the city, and said nothing. She stayed by his side for a few minutes, also in silence, and then went back to what she was doing. Marcelo, the old partner, appeared on a Thursday with a laptop under his arm, and spent 2 hours working beside Rodrigo at the dining room table, the two of them leaning over spreadsheets and development plans, as if everything were normal, as if that were any work afternoon. Camilla observed that from the kitchen and felt something that took a while to identify. It was good to see Rodrigo being treated as himself, not as the disease. With Marcelo, Rodrigo was different, more direct, faster, with that specific way people have when they are in an environment where they feel competent. And when Marcelo left and Rodrigo returned to the chair with the visible fatigue of someone who used more energy than they had available, there was satisfaction in the fatigue. It was a fatigue of return, not of surrender. That night, while Camilla prepared the medication before leaving, Rodrigo called from the room. "Camilla," she appeared at the door. "Do you need something?" "No." A pause. "I just wanted to say that you can have dinner here whenever you want. If the time gets tight, concession always makes more than is needed." It was a small gesture said as if it were practical, but it wasn't. Camilla recognized it for what it was, a retreat from professional formality to something with less distance, made by someone who didn't quite know how to do it without sounding different from how he wanted to sound. "Thank you," she said. "Sometimes I do stay late." In the days that followed, dinner happened 3 times. The first time they ate in the kitchen with Donna Conceição, with conversation about nothing important. The second time, Conceição had left early, and they had dinner in the dining room with the silence of São Paulo outside, and a conversation that went from modernist architecture to Russian literature to Camilla's childhood in Campinas, in a flow that neither of them had planned. The third time it rained hard during dinner, and they stayed on the covered balcony afterward, with the sound of the heavy rain as company, and Rodrigo told for the first time about his father, about what it had been like to inherit the company before being ready, about the weight of a legacy that you didn't choose but can't let go of. Camilla listened without interrupting, and when he finished, she said only, "You built more than you inherited. That is different." Rodrigo stared at the rain for a moment. "No one has ever told me that like that." She didn't respond, but she stayed on the balcony a while longer, until the rain subsided, and when she got up to get her bag and leave, he said, "Good night," with a voice a bit lighter than it had been at the start of that night. Camilla went down 3 flights of stairs instead of taking the elevator, as she usually did when she needed time to think. She crossed the parking garage corridor and went out to the still wet street, where the reflections of the city lights swam on the asphalt. She walked to the stop with her hands in her pockets and her thoughts in a place she hadn't yet given permission to name. There was a line she knew well. She had crossed it other times only to evaluate where she was, and had returned without transgressing it. But this time she stood at the edge a moment longer than usual, and realized, with that kind of uncomfortable clarity that honesty produces, that the terrain on the other side was becoming increasingly familiar. She boarded the bus when it arrived, sat near the window and watched the city passing by. And she thought that there are things that start on one side and arrive at another, without us being able to say exactly where the crossing step was. December arrived in São Paulo with that humid heat that the city never resolves, half summer, half storm, and the days inside the Itaim Bibi apartment acquired a cadence that Camilla already knew by heart. Rodrigo at 7:30, coffee without being requested, exercises, medication, lunch, Afternoon of reading or work with Marcelo via video call, physical therapy, dinner. And those conversations that were taking up space in the structure of the day in a way that neither of them had planned, but that also neither of them did anything to avoid. What was changing between them had the quality of things that grow too slowly for you to notice day to day, but that suddenly, when you look back, you realize have changed everything. There was no declaration, no dramatic gesture. It was more like a gradual reorganization of a space you always frequent, until one day you realize you miss it when you're not there. Rodrigo had begun to ask about her life in a way that was different from the polite curiosity of the first few weeks. He wanted to know about Campinas, about how she had chosen nursing, about whether she had gone back to see her family recently. And when she responded, he listened in a specific way, with that full attention he usually reserved for business meetings, and which now appeared in the afternoons of that silent apartment with a frequency she had stopped pretending not to notice. On her part, there was a constant vigilance over herself. Camilla knew the traps of care work, knew that the intimacy necessary to care for a fragile body created conditions for emotional confusion in both directions. She had studied this, had talked about it with colleagues, had seen it happen to other professionals. And even knowing all this, even observing with the trained lucidity of years of practice, there were moments when lucidity simply was not enough. One of those moments happened on a Wednesday afternoon, when Rodrigo, during physical therapy exercises, managed to stand without support for almost 30 seconds. It was a small milestone in the context of what the treatment represented. But Rodrigo laughed, a genuine, surprised laugh that Camila had never heard before. And she laughed too, instinctively. And for a moment they were just two people sharing a small and real joy inside a large apartment. And the professional distance she had maintained with such care was suspended in that laugh like something that had decided to take a vacation. It passed quickly. They went back to the next exercise. But the afternoon was different after that. Donna Conceição, who had the silent wisdom of people who observe much and speak little, had begun to leave 2 glasses of juice on the tray instead of 1 on her own accord, to set the dining table for 2 whenever it was clear that Camilla would stay for dinner, and to leave earlier with a naturalness that was probably coincidence and probably wasn't. Camilla faced her once with a look that meant, "I know what you're doing," and Conceição returned the look with one that said, "Well then," and went to the kitchen. Outside the apartment, however, the world had other points of view. Rodrigo's sister, Beatrice, who lived in Brasilia and had visited her brother 3 times since the diagnosis, appeared on a Friday without prior notice with the face of someone who had bought a ticket on impulse and had thought better of it on the plane, but was there anyway. She was a 42-year-old woman with the same stoicism as her brother and a frankness that came without packaging. She greeted Camilla with cordiality, stayed for the weekend, and on Sunday afternoon asked to talk alone with her on the balcony while Rodrigo took his nap. They sat in the wooden chairs with the late afternoon sun hitting the building next door, and Beatrice was direct without being cruel. "You know he is becoming attached to you." Camilla didn't look away. "I know there is a relationship of trust that has developed. It's more than that, and you know it." Beatrice didn't say it as an accusation. She said it as a fact. "I'm not blaming you. You seem to be a serious person, but he is in a vulnerable moment, and you leave at the end of the day, and he stays here." "I know my job," Camilla said calmly. "I know you do. What I am saying is different." Beatrice looked at the city for a moment. Rodrigo spent his whole life in control of everything, of the company, of relationships, of the image he presented. Now he is dependent, betrayed by a person he trusted, and he has you there. Any affection you show is going to be received in an amplified way, not because he is weak, but because he is human. Camilla was silent for a while. "What are you asking?" "Care, that's all." Beatrice stood up. "If what is happening between you is real, it survives more time and more distance. If it doesn't survive, it was better not to have happened." She went back inside, and Camilla stayed on the balcony a little longer, with her eyes on the horizon line where São Paulo dissolved into mist. Beatrice was right, and Camilla knew she was right, and that made everything harder, because the right things are rarely the ones you want to do. That week she put more distance, not abrupt, Not in a way that he could clearly identify as withdrawal, but 1 degree less openness in conversations, dinner refused with a legitimate excuse twice, the last minutes of the afternoon dedicated strictly to the chart. Rodrigo noticed. She knew he had noticed because he became quieter too, with that quality of silence of someone evaluating a change in temperature. Then, on Thursday of the following week, he said during the afternoon, "You are avoiding me." Camilla didn't stop what she was doing. "I am maintaining professionalism." There was more professionalism before the rain on the balcony. Now it seems different. She stopped. She stood with the pen in hand, looking at the chart, and thought of Beatrice's words and the years of training and the line she had stood at the edge of. "Rodrigo," she said, turning to him, "there are things that are complicated." "I know they are." He looked at her. "But you know the difference between complicated and wrong. I know you know." The silence between them lasted the time it took for São Paulo to make the turn into night outside, the lights coming on one by one in the landscape through the window. And Camilla stayed in that silence, knowing she had reached a point where moving forward and retreating were equally terrifying, which usually means you've already crossed the line without realizing exactly when. January arrived with heavy rains, and the days were getting longer inside the apartment in a way that had nothing to do with the calendar. The routine continued the same on the surface, but there was a different current underneath. One of those tensions that are not discomfort. They are expectation, and that you feel in the quality of the silence when two bodies are in a space that has become too small for the truth that neither of them had said yet. Rodrigo was improving in a way that continued to surprise the doctors. The neurologist had requested new tests after the December evaluation, and the results that arrived in the 3rd week of January brought data that he described to Camilla as clinically unexpected. The progression of the disease had slowed down significantly. Some motor functions that had been compromised since the accident showed signs of partial recovery. There was no guarantee, there was no reversal, but there was something the doctor called a window of possibility, and that phrase landed in the apartment like a stone in the center of a lake. Rodrigo was silent after Camilla read the report aloud. It was a silence different from the other silences. It wasn't that of someone processing loss. It was that of someone who doesn't quite know what to do with an opening they didn't expect to find. That afternoon he asked to stay on the balcony, something he rarely did in the January heat. Camilla brought the chair, helped with positioning, and stayed beside him, leaning on the rail, while São Paulo shone below with that irrational intensity the city had on humid summer afternoons. "Do you believe things change?" he asked without looking at her. "I work with that," she replied. "I would have given up long ago if I didn't believe it." "That's not what I'm asking." He turned to her then. "I'm asking if you believe a person changes, not the disease, not the situation. The person." Camilla looked at him. "I believe it. I've seen it many times." "And yourself? Have you changed?" She thought for a moment with real honesty, not with the ready answer that work sometimes produces. "I am changing now. Every day." Rodrigo turned his eyes back to the city. "Since you arrived here, I have learned things I didn't learn in 35 years of a life I thought I was living. About depending on someone. About what matters when the rest vanishes." A pause. "About what it means to have someone real by your side." Camilla said nothing. She waited. "I know it's complicated," he continued, with the voice of the Rodrigo of difficult negotiations, the one who said the things that needed to be said without ornament. "I know who you are to this situation formally. I know what that means for your career and what people would say. I know my sister spoke with you. I know you have serious reasons for not even wanting to hear what I am about to say." He stopped, breathed. "But I fell in love with you, and I don't want to stay in silence about it just because it's inconvenient." São Paulo continued outside, oblivious, noisy, indifferent as always. Camilla stood motionless for a moment with her eyes on the horizon and felt the weight of those words land on her not as a surprise, because somewhere she knew, but as the formal arrival of something that had been being built for months and that now needed to be recognized. "Rodrigo," she said with a voice that came out lower than she had planned. "You don't need to answer now," he interrupted. "I just needed to say it." She was silent for a while, and then she said, with that honesty she had learned to use with care but not with fear. "I also need to say something, but I have to say it the right way." He waited. "For weeks I have been fighting against something I recognize, and that at the same time scares me. Not because it isn't real, but because when something is real is when I'm most afraid of ruining it." She turned to him. "I care about you in a way that surpassed the contract I signed a long time ago, and that complicates things for me, because I am a professional first, and I am proud of that. But the truth is that you changed something in me too." The silence that followed was the kind that doesn't need to be filled. Rodrigo reached for her hand with that slowness that the state of his arm still required, and she did not pull her hand away. They stayed like that for a few minutes with São Paulo below them, and the end of the afternoon turning into night slowly, and neither of them said anything more because nothing else was necessary at that moment. In the following days, things didn't explode into a soap opera romance. They were slower than that, more real. There was still the work, the routine, the professional responsibility that Camilla hadn't thrown away because she had confessed a feeling. There were still the serious conversations that needed to happen about what that meant for the bond of care, about what it would be like to sustain a relationship in a context where dependency was still part of the equation. Those conversations happened, some easier than others, all necessary. Beatriz returned for a visit in February and found the situation different from the one she had tried to prevent in December. She spoke with Camilla again, this time without the preventive concern, but with a different quality, more like an evaluation. And at the end of that conversation, she said something Camilla kept. "He is better than he was a year ago, in a way that isn't just medical." That has its weight. Camilla's family, when they found out, reacted with the mix of concern and skepticism that was expected. Her mother called 3 times in 1 week. Her older brother was direct. "You know what could happen." And she responded with that calmness she had built over years of difficult work. "I know, but I also know what can happen if I stay afraid of everything that could happen." Rodrigo, for his part, began to appear in business meetings via video call with increasing frequency. Marcelo informed him that the company was well, that the team had held up well during the difficult months, and that there was a large project on the horizon that needed the owner's eye. And something in that phrase, the owner's eye, made Rodrigo stay quiet for a moment and then say he wanted to see the plans. In the final days of February, with the summer still heavy over São Paulo, there was an afternoon when Rodrigo stood for 2.5 minutes without any support. 2 minutes and 30 seconds that Camilla timed in silence with her phone in hand and her eyes fixed on him, and when he lowered himself slowly back to the chair with visible effort but maintained balance, she said, 2:30. Rodrigo breathed deeply. "It's more than yesterday. It's double what it was 2 weeks ago." He looked at her with that laugh that had appeared for the first time on the afternoon. He stood alone for 30 seconds, the laugh she had kept without realizing it, and said, "Then maybe I'll be able to dance at the inauguration party in Jardins." She laughed. Maybe. And in that maybe there was a whole world of things that neither of them needed to name at that moment. March in São Paulo has a quality of transition that other cities don't usually have. Neither full summer nor autumn yet, a season that hasn't decided, as if the city were on pause, breathing before the next movement. It was in this March that Rodrigo's tests brought what the neurologist called, with the restraint typical of someone who doesn't want to create expectations that medicine cannot guarantee, an exceptionally favorable result. The disease had stabilized at levels that allowed a perspective of quality of life significantly better than any projection made 12 months earlier. The spinal injuries had responded beyond expectation to continued physical therapy. And in those first weeks of March, Rodrigo walked, not with support from others, not for 30 seconds. He walked the 10 meters of the apartment hallway with the slow and careful gait of someone who is remaking something the body had stored, but with balance, with firmness, with that quality of presence that belongs to those who know what each step cost. Camilla was in the hallway when he did this for the first time. She stood on the opposite side with her arms at her sides, without offering support, because she had learned that sometimes the greatest care is letting the other person discover for themselves what they can do. When he reached the end of the hallway and turned with his hand supported on the wall, and his eyes shining with something between fatigue and incredulity, she said, with the firm voice she kept for the moments that needed firmness, "Again." He laughed, and he did it again. In those weeks, life began to reorganize itself in practical and symbolic ways at the same time. Rodrigo returned to participating in company meetings in person, first in the apartment, then at the office on short days. Marcelo received him as if nothing extraordinary were happening, with the naturalness of old partners who know that the greatest form of respect is normalcy. And the two sat at the meeting table for the first time in almost a year, with the same quality of presence that had marked their partnership for years. The decision about the event came from Rodrigo, and it was a decision he made with the deliberate clarity of things known to be right before explaining why. There was a practical reason: the inauguration of the Jardins development that had been postponed during the months of absence, and that now had a confirmed date for the end of March. But there was another reason that wasn't practical. It was necessary in a way that only makes sense to someone who has gone through something that completely redefines the map of who is by their side. He wanted people to see, not as a demonstration of strength, but as a settling of accounts with a narrative that had been told by others for too long, the narrative of Rodrigo Cavalcante, who had broken, who had been left behind, who had been abandoned by his own. He wanted to write the next chapter himself, and he wanted to write it in public, because the stories that fall apart in front of everyone need to be rebuilt in front of everyone too. The planning took 3 weeks. Beatriz flew in from Brasilia. Marcelo coordinated the guest list with Dona Conceição, who had acquired in the process of the last months the silent authority of someone who manages a house that went through serious things. Camila participated in the planning at Rodrigo's request, with the usual restraint she had learned to maintain in the spaces between the personal and the professional, although that line had already become more of a reference than a real border. She had resigned formally at the beginning of March. It was a difficult conversation to start, and clearer than she expected once initiated. The professional care bond had become unsustainable as the other bond grew, and she knew that with the same precision with which she knew when a patient was ready for a next step. Rodrigo had agreed without debate, with the rationality of someone who understands that some things don't fit in the same box, and had thanked her in a way that she couldn't hear without feeling something tighten in her chest. The clinical follow-up had passed to a physical therapist, hired on the neurologist's recommendation. The transition was made with the care Camilla applied to all patient transitions, with detailed documentation, overlapping time, so the new professional understood the particularity of the case, and one last formal consultation where she delivered the complete chart and told her colleague that Rodrigo responded well to established routines and poorly to abrupt ruptures. The colleague asked if there was anything else relevant about the patient. Camilla thought for a second and said, "He appreciates honesty more than anything else. If there is bad news, say it right away. He prefers to know." On the eve of the event, Rodrigo and Camila had dinner together in the apartment for the last time, in the configuration that had developed over those months, with Dona Conceição serving without comments and the balcony open to the late March evening that had finally decided to turn into autumn. They spoke about the next day, about nervousness that was different from business nervousness, about what it meant to appear after a long absence. "Will you be there?" he asked, which technically didn't need to be asked, but was the real question underneath the practical question. "I'll be there," she said, and that answer contained everything that needed to be said on that eve. On the morning of the event, Rodrigo woke up early. He performed the tasks alone that he had learned to do alone in the last 2 months, with the careful slowness that had replaced his old efficiency and that carried another quality, the quality of someone who had learned the value of each movement. He looked at himself in the bathroom mirror for a moment, in the grey suit he had sent to be adjusted for a body slightly different from the body of the past, and recognized the face looking back as the face of someone who had crossed something and arrived on the other side with one less weight and one more understanding. The event was in the space of the Jardins development, a hall with high ceilings and lighting that made the architectural details shine with exactness. The guests arrived with that quality of veiled curiosity that people bring when they go to see someone they haven't seen in a while, mixing the genuine with the social in a proportion that is impossible to separate. There were faces Rodrigo recognized as those who had stayed, and faces he recognized as those who had vanished, and he looked at everyone with the same calm expression of someone who has already done the math and no longer needs to discuss the results. Camilla arrived with Beatrice, who had picked her up at the apartment with the naturalness of someone who had decided that it was simply that way. She wore a dark blue dress she had bought the previous week, with the uncertain help of her mother's opinion over the phone, and when she entered the hall and her eyes found Rodrigo's from across the space, there was a moment of recognition that didn't need words. Then he walked toward her, across the entire hall, with the slow and firm steps that were the real steps, not the steps from before, and with the hand he had learned to use again, reaching for hers when he arrived. The hall didn't go dramatically silent, but there was an adjustment of temperature in that space that the people present felt without knowing exactly how to name it, the kind of moment that doesn't need to be announced to be understood. Before 200 people who had gathered in that Jardins hall to see the launch of a development and who were now observing something different from what they expected, Rodrigo Cavalcante stood with Camilla's hand in his and said, with the microphone Marcelo had discreetly placed before him seconds earlier, "Thank you for coming." That was how it began. Not with a prepared speech nor with the calculated eloquence he had learned in decades of presentations for partners and investors. It was with that simplicity that true things have when they no longer need armor. "It has been almost a year," he continued, "since I learned the difference between having people around and having people by your side. It seems like the same thing. It isn't." He paused, and the quality of the silence in the hall was that of someone who is truly listening. There was a time when I had a lot around me and very little by my side. It took an illness and an accident for me to understand that. I don't recommend the method, but I am grateful for the learning. Some people laughed, the soft laugh of those being reached. "This woman," he said, and there was a quality in his voice that the Rodrigo of business meetings rarely used, something close to the voice of a person who is speaking without calculating the effect, arrived at my house as a professional I hadn't asked for, at a moment when I didn't want anyone to arrive, and she stayed. Not because the contract said she should stay. She stayed because she was the type of person who stays. He looked at Camilla, whose eyes were shining with that specific restraint of someone who was trained not to show emotion in public, and is clearly losing that battle. She cared for me when I didn't want to be cared for. She told me the truth when it was easier to stay silent. She made me laugh in a period when I thought I had forgotten how, and she taught me, without ever having explicitly taught, that vulnerability is not the opposite of strength. The hall was quiet in the way halls get when something real happens inside them. Rodrigo lowered himself slowly, with that careful slowness of movements that cost a lot to be reconquered, and knelt on the marble floor of the development he had built. There was a second in which the silence became absolute, that kind of absolute you recognize as a moment people will remember. "Camilla," he said, with the firm voice he used for things that had no margin for doubt, "I know we started from a complicated place. I know there is still much to build and some things to deconstruct. But I also know that when I needed someone real, it was you who was there. And I want you to continue being there." He opened the small box Marcelo had kept in his tie as a favor that had cost weeks of convincing. "Will you?" Camilla stood looking at him for a moment. She knew she would keep forever. That man kneeling on the marble who had learned to get up in so many different ways, with his eyes on her, and the question between them with the simultaneous lightness and weight of the things that truly matter. "Yes," she said. The hall filled with applause that she heard from far away, because the only sound that mattered at that moment was that of her own heart, which had learned over months of hallways and balconies and rain and silence to beat in a rhythm that was no longer just hers. Beatrice cried without any restraint. Donna Conceição, who had been invited and was standing at the back of the hall with her bag squeezed in her lap, let out a smile she didn't try to hide. Marcelo clapped with the strength of someone who had kept that joy for months, and those who had vanished observed in silence, with that particular silence of someone watching the reconstitution of something they thought had ended and discovering they were mistaken. In the following months, Rodrigo and Camilla's life was built the way real things are built, slowly, with stumbles, with difficult conversations, and with those mornings when the light enters through the Itaim Bibi apartment window in a way that seems too simple for how much it cost to get there. He returned to the company at an increasing pace, with the new wisdom of someone who knows how to separate the urgent from the important. She opened a specialized care clinic in Itaim Bibi, with Rodrigo's support and the partnership of 2 colleagues, because she had learned over the years that knowledge that costs so much needs to be shared. The disease had not disappeared. No doctor had promised it would disappear. It had stabilized, it had receded more than expected. It had opened that window that no one guarantees will stay open forever. But both had learned, each in their own way, that uncertainty is not the enemy of life, it is its condition. On a winter morning, when São Paulo woke up with that humid cold the city only pretends to have, and the sun entered through the balcony with the specific quality of July light, Rodrigo prepared the coffee without needing help. He set out 2 cups, and when Camilla entered the kitchen with her hair still loose and her feet bare on the cold floor, she found the coffee ready, and the city outside, and that man who had learned to stand in so many different ways, smiling at her, with the laugh she had kept since the first time it appeared. "Good morning," he said. "Good morning," she replied. And in that simplicity was everything the Itaim Bibi mansion had learned to contain: the pain that had passed, the care that had stayed, and the love that was born in the most unlikely place in the world, between the marble and the wound, between obligation and choice. What started as a job became a life. What seemed like an end became a beginning. And São Paulo, noisy and indifferent as always, does not know what it shelters. But they know. End of story. Dear listeners, if the story of Rodrigo and Camilla touched any part of you, know that it was made exactly for that. To remind you that true care transforms, that honesty has a cost worth paying, and that sometimes love arrives when you least expect it, in the form of someone who simply stays. If you've made it this far, you're already part of this story. Subscribe to the channel and activate the bell, because every week we bring new narratives that explore what is most profound and human in life. Leave your like. It is what tells us it's worth continuing. And in the comments, tell us, have you ever had someone like that by your side? Someone who stayed when everything made it easier to leave? We are waiting for you. Until the next story.